If you'd like to see how I created this little expressive bird using gouache paints, then stay tuned and I'll explain exactly what I'm doing along the way. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. Now, I'm no expert with gouache, but if you don't know what it is, gouache is kind of like an opaque watercolor. You can actually thin the paints down with water so they're more transparent, or you can paint them thickly and opaquely with less water, almost like an acrylic. I liked this particular reference photo because it was quite colourful and it allowed me to play with more of the different colours with my new set of gouache paints. I'm starting with the background and adding in a few different greens, blues and browns with a fair amount of water mixed into my paint. I've started with a dry paper, so it's a wet on dry technique because I wanted my brush strokes to show a bit more and I didn't want them to blend out too much. If I did want a softer transition between my colours, then I could have pre-wet my paper, which lets the colour dissolve outwards a little bit and it creates a softer edge so you can't see the brush strokes and the separation of the colours as much. I'm working on Fabriano Artistico hot pressed watercolour paper and it's in the 5" by 7" size, and I've actually used masking tape to tape around the edge of my piece to give it a nice clean border, which makes the total size of the painting 4" by 6". This was actually my first time trying gouache and I really just wanted to try out the paints and have a bit of fun with it, so I wasn't going for anything too perfect in this one, just a bit of an experiment. So I'm starting on those little red berries and I'm using quite a wet, transparent mix to start off with, just so I can build up my colours gradually. I can then go back in once it's dry and build up the opacity and the richness if I want to. These berries are a little bit in the background, so while it's wet, I'm adding in some of the darker colours around the berries so that the colours will bleed into each other and it will create a softer effect where the berries will look a little bit more blurred out, and this effect will help push the fruit to the back of the painting compared to the bird, which will be a little bit more crisp and in focus. I am adding in some of those branches and I'm making sure to use a few different coloured browns, and I've even mixed in some purple in the branches to give it a bit more interest. When you're doing something like branches or something that seems to be one colour, try and mix up the colours slightly so it makes it look a little more interesting. So a few different shades of browns or adding in those purples or magentas, and that will help stop the colour looking flat as well. I'm starting on the bird now and I'm just blocking in where the main colours will go. I'm not too worried about the details yet because the good thing about gouache is that it's opaque enough to go over the top of your previous layer and define and alter things as you go. Whereas with watercolour, once you've put paint somewhere, it's really hard to fix any mistakes or add any opaque colours over the top or highlights or anything like that because of how transparent watercolour is. If you are starting out with a new medium that you've never used before, I'd highly recommend doing some swatches and trying out how the paints actually work. Maybe play around with shading some circles or something easy like that, just so you can get a feel for it and work out how the paint actually works without going straight into a project. So I'm moving on to the next layer of the background and I'm building up those colours. I want them to be quite bright and opaque and not so wishy-washy, so I'm going to continue this way by creating a layer of paint and then letting it dry, and then going back in with more layers until I achieve the result that I'm after. Despite what I was just saying, I actually didn't do any swatches or practice tests with this gouache. I just went straight in with this piece just to see what I could do with it, but I always have an open mind, and if it doesn't work out, then at least I would have learnt a few things that I can try differently in my next project. On the branch, I'm adding some white gouache, but I've watered it down a fair bit so that when it dries, it's slightly transparent. It will show through the browns and the purples that are underneath, but it will still look like a lighter highlight. If you've never used gouache before and you want to try it out, you can actually just use a white gouache paint and mix it with your watercolor paints. Just a hint of white gouache will make the watercolor paint opaque. You can also mix between watercolor and gouache, so if you wanted to start out by laying down a few transparent layers and then add some opaque gouache on top, then you can do that. You can also do it the other way around or swap between layers if you like. If you use both, you'd be able to get different effects for different parts of your painting if you want to as well. So it's really versatile if you use gouache with watercolor. I'm defining some of those reds and oranges in the berries, and you can already see how much brighter and more saturated the second layer of paint is. And I'm putting in some of those textures in the branch by adding some strokes following the curve of the branch. So you want to make sure that you do follow the curve of the branch, because if you went straight up and down, the branch will look two-dimensional and flat, so you need to curve your stroke to show that the branch is also curved. Here is where I'm starting to add some of those splatter effects, and I do this quite often with my expressive watercolor pieces as well. So basically, you want to load up your paintbrush with some paint and then tap the handle of the brush on the back of your hand so that the paint splatters onto your work. The more water that you add to your brush, the more transparent your splatters will be. And you can also use different size brushes to create different size splatters. If your paper is dry when you do this effect, your splatter marks will have a defined shape, whereas if you dampen your paper first, your splatters will seep out and soften into the paper, so it will create a more blurry, blended effect. I love how the splatters look in the end result, and I find it gives a really nice, fun feeling to my watercolor pieces, so I thought I'd try it with my gouache as well. If you find that you've put too much paint down or you've got a splatter in the wrong spot, you can actually lift up some of the paint with a tissue while it's still wet. You can also mask off your subject with masking fluid or something similar if you don't want to get any splatters on your main subject in the first place. Going back in with a smaller brush for some of those finer details, and I don't want this painting to be too detailed. I want to keep it expressive with broader brush strokes, but I do want to get some of the texture in its feathers. I like the expressive look, so I don't use the teeny tiny brushes. I used a slightly thicker one to stop myself from adding those tiny details unnecessarily. I just wanted to give the general idea of the texture. Again, I'm just building up the layers until I'm happy with my end result. So I've used watercolor a few times before, and I've made a few tutorials with it as well. And I'm not an expert in watercolor yet, but I've been watching James Gurney's YouTube videos, and I'll leave a link in the description to his channel. But he uses gouache a lot, and I was so mesmerized that I just really wanted to try gouache. And I already work in pastels, graphite, colored pencil, charcoal, watercolor, acrylic, and oil. So, I mean, what's the harm in adding one more medium to that list? I told myself I wouldn't buy any gouache, I'd wait for my birthday or Christmas, but I came across someone selling 10 tubes of the Winsor & Newton's designer gouache on Gumtree, which is kind of like an Australian version of Craigslist or eBay, for $20. And that's an absolute bargain considering each single tube here sells between $10 and $30 in Australia. So anyway, these tubes that I bought were slightly used, but they look like they've only been used once, and none of them were dried out, so of course I had to get them. I actually really enjoyed using gouache. I'm not 100% sure how to use it properly yet, but I'm just going to keep practicing and creating pieces a bit like this one, probably more expressive like the watercolor pieces, because I like that you can create those looks with the watercolor and gouache. And I save my more detailed hyperrealism or photorealism for pastels or colored pencils and things like that. But yeah, I actually prefer the gouache over watercolor. So I'd highly recommend giving them a try if you're sitting on the fence about it, or even just use the white gouache and mix it with your watercolors if you already have watercolors. I've put together a playlist on the screen that I thought you might enjoy, so click on that and I'll see you over there.